Hello, welcome to Talking Data Equity for Friday, September 15th, 2023. We are very, very happy to see you again or see you for the first time. And my name is Heather Kraus. I'm coming to you today from Toronto. And this is Talking Data Equity, which is almost every weekly event hosted by We All Count, which is a project for equity in data. And what Talking Data Equity is an informal gathering where anybody from any country, any sector, any job title, any level of expertise or experience with data and technology can come and have a conversation about what is working, what isn't working, what are the ideas, what are you learning about how to align the data projects that we're working on with the values that we're trying to center, the equity goals that your particular project and context has. Sometimes we talk about a really specific technical skill or a way to analyze data or a way to collect data, and sometimes we have a special guest. And today is one of the special guest days. And this is a special guest that I am personally extremely excited to get to have with us today. We have Chelsea Barabas. Did I say your last name correctly?
Pretty close. We Barabas is what we say, but yeah.
Barabas.
Good
Thank
job.
you.
Yeah.
I did practice, but then uh, I forgot. And actually, I think that we can now refer to Chelsea as Doctor. Successfully completing her PhD very recently. So we are so grateful that Chelsea will spend some time with us today. And I know a lot of you have already read some of Chelsea's work, but not everybody has. So I'm going to give you a really, really brief description. And then what we're going to do is we'll put the recording and lots of other links to Chelsea's work in the community forum. I just put a link to the community forum in the chat. But bottom line, I first got to see Chelsea talk before the pandemic, a long time ago, when she came here to my city in Toronto to talk about artificial intelligence and ethics at the University of Toronto, near where I live. And I learned so much and was so impressed by Chelsea's ability to cut through the bullshit and not uh not not just buy into the easy feel good explanations about like how to do ethical AI or how to do data for good, but really point out how so many of the ideas about ethical AI and data for good are actually perpetuating really problematic power dynamics and privilege. And that if we really want to use data and technology to move the needle on power dynamics, actually start to achieve some equity, we're going to have to think a little bit more deeply. I'm not going to go through Chelsea's whole bio because it would take our whole hour. But bottom line, like I said, newly minted doctor and a lot of expertise and hands-on experience working with data and technology, doing things like researching cryptocurrency, researching conservation drones in Kenya, building bots that do cool things, while also getting lots and lots of conceptual and academic experience in feminist studies, Arabic and African literature, critical media sociology, and then working at MIT and a variety of projects and leadership positions at the MIT Media Lab. Which is a very cool place. So we'll link to lots of those projects and lots of different things you can read in the community forum. But that's all the time I want to take up in our hour. And I'm going to turn it over to Chelsea now. And as usual, we're going to run this as a Zoom meeting, which means that we're going to ask that you stay on mute just while Chelsea's sharing some stories and some examples. Feel free to use the Zoom chat all you want at that time. And then if there's time at the end, that's when we'll get you to unmute and raise your hands and ask questions. Okay. Thank you for joining us, Chelsea. I am so excited. I think this has been like 9 years in the making for me.
Yeah, I was just thinking, I forgot it. That Toronto talk was quite a while ago. I think it was 2019, maybe. Yeah. So
I think it was, yeah.
yeah, January 19. But that's so cool that you were there. And that's yeah, great to kind of know that, yeah, you'll probably see kind of the arc and development of the work if that's your kind of starting point for it. So I just want to say thank you to everybody who's here today. This is super exciting. For me as well. When Heather reached out, she really described this as a group of people who are really practitioners, not just like in the conceptual space, but really out in the world, trying to make sense of kind of all the complexities that are out there. And I thought that this was really my ideal group of people to be kind of talking with and kind of sharing some of my work. So I've titled this Data Equity in Action, really some frank reflections from the field. And that's kind of how I want to think about this and structure this, is like really kind of reflecting on some of the hands-on projects I've had the opportunity to work on in the past and some of the lessons I've learned from that. As Heather mentioned, I did recently just finish my PhD like this month. My field of study, I generally define as race critical code studies, which is a term from Dr. Ruha Benjamin, I'm sure some of you are familiar with. And that's kind of a field of study that tries to combine sociological studies around social movements with critical race studies to really try to understand how social inequities get coded into our contemporary racial landscape through technology. I'm really interested in particular in the role that what I call computational practitioners play in supporting struggles for social justice through technology. And this term computational practitioners is really broad for me. This includes people who work in academia and industry and government, who are not just software developers, but also people like myself, who largely identifies as a qualitative sociologist of technology. It includes policymakers, really this really broad group. And I think this group is interesting, and it's important to keep broad because I think there are a lot of different ways that technology has become a focal point of conversations around social justice across many different spheres. And it's really kind of important and interesting to think about the roles that these different players play. I have kind of looked at the role of computational practitioners through the lens of kind of doing my own hands-on projects over the last several years. So I've had the opportunity to work with state agencies as well as grassroots organizations. I've worked with artists and data scientists on speculative technology projects, as well as worked on a variety of different advocacy campaigns related to kind of issues specifically related to issues of like data-driven reforms within the criminal legal system. So that's what I'm going to be drawing from today. A lot of this stuff does come from my dissertation, but my dissertation is also not your kind of what you might think of as a typical dissertation. I was really inspired by the work of this guy named Paul Rabinow, who wrote this book, Reflections on Fieldwork in Morocco. He's an anthropologist. And this was the second book he wrote. It was the book he wrote after writing the book that was based on his fieldwork. And in this book, what he really tries to do is really, in a very practical and frank way, talk about some of the ethical challenges that came up, some of the mistakes that he made when actually doing his fieldwork. And it ended up being probably his most influential piece of scholarship because it raised some of these more fundamental questions about how he, as this white anthropologist from the United States, how he showed up in the work as an anthropologist when he traveled to Morocco, and the various ways that through his interactions with his subjects of study, his worldview got kind of turned upside down, and he gained kind of this meta wisdom about the role of people like him in kind of producing knowledge and pursuing work that that supports decolonial ends and things like that. So I try to think of my work as kind of like the computational 21st century version of that, and that's what I'm going to kind of try to share today. So I want to start kind of early on in this work for me, and really kind of share just a few stories from the work and some of the things that I've come to grapple with through that. And I'm going to start around 2017, 2018, when I joined a research initiative called the Ethics and Governance of Artificial Intelligence Initiative. This was designed as a multidisciplinary effort. I was working really closely with a lawyer and a data scientist at the time. And the focus of our work is really trying to understand the role of data in criminal justice reform. And specifically, we were really interested in understanding the role of criminal risk assessments in a variety of different reform efforts. A lot of this interest stemmed from an investigative journalism piece that was written in 2016, which many of you might even be familiar with. It's called Machine Bias. And in this expose, the journalists at ProPublica did a close audit of a criminal risk assessment tool called Compass. Compass is widely used across the country, and it's often sold as this means of limiting the bias of criminal justice practitioners and making decisions for things like who should be eligible for probation or parole, who should be released from jail when they're waiting for their trials. But what the ProPublica found was that Compass actually systematically overestimated the risk of Black people as compared to white people when their data was fed into this tool, which led to longer and harsher sentences, and you know, raised all these really interesting and important concerns around the ways that we replicate many of our biased views through the making of these tools. This kind of set off a really rigorous debate within academia as well. Criminal risk assessments became one of these thought exercises that people use to try to formalize some of the different trade-offs in designing data-driven tools like this. So here's one of the more influential papers in this area. You see, it's very mathy, right? It's a lot of ways of trying to formalize, you know, very lofty ideas such as fairness, and transparency through kind of very complicated, kind of formalized mathematical approaches. And in the beginning, we were also very interested in this. We were particularly interested in figuring out how risk assessments could be improved, because we did see them as like a promising potential intervention of in curtailing kind of the implicit biases of key decision makers. So in our work, what we did is we started out first by talking to a lot of people. And some of the early people we reached out to was a community bail fund based in Boston, Massachusetts. And the reason we reached out to this bail fund was because one of the areas where risk assessments were really starting to spread was as a response to mass pretrial incarceration, or as a response to calls for bail reform. For those of you who aren't super familiar with bail reform and some of that, those issues, what we've seen over the last 30 years or so is a massive increase in the number of people who are detained actually before they even go to trial. And the reason that they are largely kept behind bars is because they're not able to pay the bail amount that the judges set for them. And so risk assessments were embraced as kind of this way of trying to nudge judges towards setting lower bail amounts so that more people can get out of jail and have their presumption of innocence and liberty restored before their trial date. So we wanted to talk with community bail funds because they were people who were kind of working on the front lines of this issue. Bail funds are people who raise money to basically post bail for people who can't afford it. And then they do a lot of work to make sure that those people are set up for success and able to go to their court dates and things like that. So we reached out to them to brainstorm different ways we might be able to work with them. We were particularly interested in ways we might integrate some of the data that the bail fund collected into risk assessment models to improve their performance over time. So we were kind of pitching some of these ideas to these leaders from this bail fund, and they were pretty stoic. Like I'll say, you know, like it felt kind of like we were talking to a wall or something. So like maybe like 20, 30 minutes into like what I was calling a brainstorm, but it was really much more like a monologue on our part because we were, you know, throwing out ideas and they weren't really getting much response. I just said, hey guys, what's up? Did we say something that's wrong? Like, you know, like what's going on? And that's when the director of the bail fund, a woman named Tara, you know, I think she made a decision to just kind of be real with us. And what she said is like, listen, you're not the first set of academics who've come to talk to us and want to work with us and use our data. But what we found is that most academics are really only interested in asking their own questions. They're not asking us how we would approach this issue. And for the most part, the questions that they want to ask are harmful to the people that we serve. And she elaborated on that. And one thing that she really helped us to see was like, we've taken for granted that these criminal risk assessments were the best intervention to be investing our time and energy in. But the reality is that there were already strong legal protections in place that say, like, listen, most people who've been charged with a crime should be released from jail. But the reality was that judges just weren't following the law. They weren't following, they weren't making decisions in accordance with these strong legal protections. So they told us, rather than investing resources and trying to improve these risk assessments, why don't we try to use data in ways to build stronger structures of accountability and shed light on the fact that the day-to-day practices that judges are implementing in their courts are technically outside of the letter of the law. So this was a real wake-up call for us. It was the beginning of many more fruitful conversations about how our group might go about asking better questions, as well as how we might set up structures of accountability in our work that were accountable to communities that were working with directly impacted people. And I think for us, it was really important to have this issue of mass pretrial incarceration reframed in this way that centered judges, as opposed to trying to micromanage and forecast the risk of criminalized people. And we realized that by inverting that narrative in that way, Tara and her collaborators were really actually inverting this much broader narrative that we see in this space around data for social good, which is that we often do see the default orientation of a lot of the work in this field being about focusing exclusively on kind of monitoring or tracking or measuring different outputs related to people who are in positions of relatively less power or communities that are more marginalized. And there's reasons for that I want to get into later. So why is that default orientation the way that we think about a lot of these projects? But for us, this was a huge pivot point for us. What we realized is what we wanted to do was we did want to keep working on data-driven reforms within the criminal legal system regarding bail reform, but we wanted to start to shift the algorithmic lens upward, to really start to think about how we make an explicit analysis of who's in power and who really drives these outcomes in the system. So over the next few years, we really tried a variety of experiments and trying to think about how we would use data for judge accountability. And we realized that this would really require us to think about how we might use data to surface insights into the past, present, and future ways that judges were making decisions. Now, as we started this work, it wasn't really immediately apparent to us what the most effective approach might be to studying judges or building accountability in this way. One of the big reasons for this is that it wasn't immediately clear where we would even get data related to this. So our court system in general does not collect data about judges. It doesn't collect data about prosecutors. The whole, court administration is all geared towards, gathering and collecting data about criminal history and things like that. So at first it seemed like there were these big gaps in the data that we would have to fill. But upon closer inspection, we also realized actually a lot of this administrative data, there's a specific narrative that has been imposed on it in terms of criminal history, this being about defendants. But we could actually put a different narrative on this. So we could actually think about this as being indicative of or shedding light on judge behavior. So for example, there are records about how much money a judge sets for a bail. That's information about the judge. It's framed right now as information about a defendant, but we could use this in other ways. The trick with this, though, is that we'd seen from other examples of other police departments, court administrations around the country that often when you try to shift that narrative to use data like this to scrutinize people who are in power, a lot of that data gets revoked, right? So here's an example from the Chicago Police Department who released an API to some of their data. Journalists and researchers started to use it to kind of raise some important issues around the behaviors of the police, and they immediately pulled that API. So we're like, okay, how are we going to get around these kinds of challenges as well? What we ended up doing was taking a three-pronged approach. What we thought of as an insider approach, an outsider approach, and a speculative approach to this work. So the insider approach was forging a collaboration with a a statewide agency, administration of the courts. And what we were going to try to do is actually use their administrative data to build a judge dashboard, basically a dashboard that would enable administrators to track what reforms were being implemented in the courts and the degree to which judges were kind of abiding by those new guidelines of those reforms. With the hope being that we could follow up on some of the trends we were seeing, do some interviews with judges, and then come back to them with more targeted kind of data interventions, ways of saying, oh, you have this, you believe that people who are facing felonies are more likely to abscond from justice and not show up for court. Let's go test that empirically with our data and see if that actually holds true. And if it doesn't, we'll follow back with you and kind of like, we can have a conversation about that. That was kind of the idea there. Then we also had an outsider approach to trying to study this. And for that, we kind of took on a support role working with CourtWatch MA, which was a grassroots effort to train people to go into courtrooms, observe the proceedings of a court, and then actually gather data about different decisions that judges were making. So this was a grassroots data collection, okay? And then the third project was actually, we built our own risk assessment tool on our own terms. So we built a judge risk assessment tool that used much of the same kinds of data that's used to evaluate defendants, to develop a predictive score for judges on the the extent to which they were likely to follow the law. So we have summarized and written up kind of a comprehensive kind of set of learnings from this in this paper. I'd love to point you guys to, along with my 3 collaborators here, JB Rabinovitz, Colin Doyle, and Karthik Dinakar, 2 data scientists and a lawyer, and a sociologist walk into a bar, and this is what comes out. So I would really recommend checking that out. I'm going to summarize some of the findings of this now. Just what I really want to do is kind of share some of the challenges of these different strategies and what we learned from it. So the first one I want to talk about is this outsider strategy of doing the CourtWatch program. I think, we were really optimistic about this. We were particularly interested in, there was a new statutory guideline that the Supreme Court in Massachusetts had just issued that was requiring judges to basically ask a defendant about their ability to pay bail before setting bail. With the idea being, if you ask somebody, are you employed? How much do you make in a week? Things like that, judges would make a more reasonable kind of determination of what an appropriate bail would be. The thing with this guideline was there was no enforcement in place. We didn't have any insight into whether or not judges were actually doing this. So we trained people to go into the courtroom and try to just basically see, are judges asking people about their ability to pay? This turned out to be really, really challenging and very labor intensive for a number of reasons. For one, courts, this public institution where, we're all, technically able to go in and attend a court hearing and see what's happening, make it very difficult for you to collect data and gather accurate information. It's actually impossible. In Massachusetts, you're not allowed to bring in a laptop into the courtroom. You're not even allowed to bring in a phone. So all of the data collection we had to do was on paper with pen and paper. And then we had a whole lot of work we had to do on the back end to basically digitize that and try to, develop a, spreadsheet with insights from this. And I think through this process, we realized that, first off, a lot of the data we collected was not very high quality. It wasn't data that we're going to be able to do some sort of like rigorous statistical analysis with, just because there were just so many external factors at play and trying to train lay people to go into a courtroom, understand what's going on, and then accurately record it. And then it was really labor intensive to just try to translate that into a digitized format that we could do stuff with. So we did do some successful campaigns, particularly targeting the district attorney in the area. And, had some interesting conversations emerge from this work, but it did raise some deeper questions around, was all of the labor we put into this data-driven strategy really worth it for the outcomes that we were trying to achieve? And I think this raises these deeper questions around kind of the gatekeeping around kind of data, and one of the big power moves in like emphasizing data-driven reforms in general is that only some organizations have the resources and capacity to actually collect data to make these kinds of decisions. And then they have the power to decide who has access to that data. So that powerfully shapes the terms of debate and the types of interventions we see in this place. And this is why I think criminal risk assessment had become so popular, is because the powers that be had that data available to them, and it fit within a narrative that was comfortable for them. It was tough to challenge that because there really wasn't a lot of other data around. So this idea that kind of like data-driven reforms are like this apolitical kind of unbiased approach to these things, I think needs to be challenged a bit, because there is a whole political economy around gathering data and having the resources to analyze it that a lot of community grassroots organizations just don't have access to. So that's the outsider approach and some of the challenges we face. The insider challenges we face now working with a state-based agency, I think, are even more interesting and a little bit more nuanced. So we were also, trying to navigate these issues of access in forging like a memorandum of understanding with the state-based government. We were very aware that this was going to be a politically sensitive project because we were trying to build a dashboard to shed light on judges' behavior. And so it took several months of negotiation to kind of come to an agreement about how we were going to do this, what we were going to use the data for. During this process, we had a brainstorm with some members of the agency who had a couple of other ideas for projects they thought would be cool for us to integrate into the dashboard. One of them was trying to evaluate or to build in some sort of impact assessment for other types of reforms that the agency was trying to put into place. So this included things like trying to measure the impact of things like electronic monitoring, which is basically putting an ankle monitor on somebody as a condition of their release that, tracks their movements and makes sure they don't go into certain zip codes or leave a certain zip code or leave a certain kind of predefined geographic space. This intervention had really begun to skyrocket in the state, and these administrators were concerned that it was getting out of hand and that this was actually kind of having an adverse impact on the people that they were working with. So they said, maybe you guys can use this data to actually do an impact evaluation for us. And we can take that to judges and say, use that as the basis for a conversation of like, hey, maybe we could curtail these practices in these different ways. We were initially really excited about this idea. It seemed like a really practical, way to kind of engage in this conversation. But as we started talking, we circled back with some of our community organizations that we were working with. And as we started talking about like the ways on the ground they had observed these electronic monitors impacting people's lives, things like, destabilizing people's employment or making it hard for them to meet their familial obligations, like for doing things like going grocery shopping and stuff like that. As we started seeing those kind of adverse impacts being described, we realized we really didn't have data from the courts to capture and measure those impacts. In fact, the only impact we were going to be able to measure was whether or not somebody had been arrested again once they'd been put on electronic monitoring. So through these conversations with these community groups, they said, listen, we think it's actually probably better for you guys not to do this study because we think it might actually lead to an erasure of the harms that we're seeing. If we say you've done a rigorous data-driven study and the only impacts we can measure are in terms of recidivism, that's going to cause people to overlook all of these other ways that these things are harmful. And by the way, we don't want them necessarily now to start expanding the data that they collect on people. We'd rather them just not do this study. So we were a bit disappointed by this at first, I think, because this was a point we thought of potential influence for us to be able to kind of like influence these conversations. But then also we thought on a practical kind of side of things is that we were a little concerned that this might jeopardize our access to the data that we wanted to do the dashboard. So we were grappling with these questions of like, do I do this project? And if so, on what terms? And if I don't do this project, then what? What's going to happen? Is this door going to be closed on us? And I think that's something that honestly, like practitioners out in the field deal with a lot, but doesn't get talked about a lot, is like this fear of like doors being closed for the bigger kind of project we're trying to do. And I just wanted to raise that as like something that has a really powerful influence on the things we decide to take on and the things we don't do down the line. We also, through this work, though, I think really started to grapple with the limits of like information-based theories of change, especially culture change. And I think specifically, so we did, move forward with some of this work. And we found that even when we presented judges with like statistically rigorous evaluations of things and facts, it didn't do much to like move the needle on the culture of fear that really drove a lot of these decisions within the courtroom. And I just want to give you guys a specific example. So on these pretrial reports that judges were given, there were a number of data points that were usually included. One of the data points that the administration of the courts decided to remove was prior escapes. Had a defendant been charged with a prior escape before? And the judges were really resistant to this, and it created a lot of antipathy between the court administration and the judges, because judges thought that the courts were withholding really important and relevant information for them, which is captured in this quote from an interview I did with a judge. Let's see, I've got to remove the... So he said, if you're charged with escape, you can't ignore that and say they're 90% likely to come back to court. No, they're not coming back to court. They're going to try to escape. That's the big one that all the judges make fun of the pretrial agency about. So here he's just, kind of outlining like how this doesn't really make sense. And on its surface, you might think, okay, this doesn't make sense. If part of my job is to make sure I don't release people who are going to run off to Canada or something to avoid seeing their day in court, then that seems like a relevant piece of information. If you dig a little bit deeper, though, which is what we did next, we realized, oh, the reason why pretrial had actually removed this from their set of data that they kind of provided was because this thing wasn't predictive anymore of any of the outcomes like failure to appear in court. And the reason for that is because electronic monitoring had been included under this rubric of potential escape. So if somebody was given an ankle monitor on their bracelet on their ankle, and that thing went off, basically as saying like, oh, this person has, gone outside their pre-specified GPS coordinates, that would raise a red flag and mark them as having tried to escape. So this category of escape, which used to just be about people who had literally broken out of a jail and run away, had expanded massively to include any time these ankle monitors went off. And these ankle monitors are notorious for being really finicky. Like they in some places produce up to 80%, false alarms. So as a result, this data point was no longer like predictive of anything that was relevant to judges. We tried to talk about this with judges, and break this down in a variety of different ways. We just could never really get that through to them. So for us, that really made us grapple with this idea of like, okay, if this is at the end of the day about trying to shift this culture of fear around people running away or, engaging in violent crime, is data really going to help shift those views and those beliefs down the line? Eventually, I will say this project did get shut down before we completed it. It got put on pause, and then the pandemic happened and it kind of never got picked back up again. But I think a big reason for this was because judges were really resistant to having their behavior like formally monitored using data and things like that. So we were bummed for a while, but we didn't eventually end up repurposing the data that we'd received from that administration of the courts. Basically what we decided to do was to try a different kind of project. And in this project, what we wanted to do was kind of explore in a very intuitive way some of the limitations of criminal risk assessment by subjecting judges to a similar set of methods to develop a judge risk assessment tool. So we made a tool that instead of measuring a defendant's likelihood to fail to appear, we were measuring a judge's likelihood to fail to adhere to the Constitution. And we did this by combining the court data that we'd received from the courts with our own data that we collected from online, things like hair color, marital status, whether or not somebody had been a public defender before, how long they'd been on the bench, and things like that. And we used a stochastic gradient boosting machine basically to develop a risk assessment tool that ended up being significantly more accurate than the defendant risk assessment score. So in general, our accuracy scores were coming in the 83 percentile range in comparison to risk assessments, which criminal risk assessments were really like barely better than a coin flip most of the time. We found it very interesting that our judge risk assessment had the same factor be the most predictive factor of failure to adhere, which was age. And we also found that a number of other just sort of demographic pieces of data were also really, things that really aren't in within the realm of control of a judge, like their yeah, their hair color, things like that, were the most predictive factors. So we thought, if we presented this to judges, they're going to have a lot of, they're going to balk at this notion that we could actually predict their future behavior using this kind of demographic information like their age. And they would find it especially problematic if we framed it in terms of behavior that was potentially criminal, right? Failing to adhere to the Constitution is a really serious offense. But the point with this for us was not really to use this in a practical setting. It was really because in many ways, the development of our tool just replicated a lot of the same ethical problems as the criminal risk assessments did. But we really viewed this more as a thought exercise and a way for us to really stretch our imaginations because what we tried to do was develop a risk assessment that looked up at judges in a way that would help to expose the many forms of stigmatization that were embedded in these technologies by using things like age and things like that to forecast some sort of criminal, like the likelihood of some sort of criminal activity. We also found the fact that our tool was actually more accurate than criminal risk assessments really interesting, and thought this could also raise some really interesting future work around how we might bring a theory of power or a theory of agency to the development of these kinds of tools. And what I mean by that is, like, pretrial defendants arguably have the least amount of agency and power over whether or not they're incarcerated before their trials, right? So rather than frame the issue of bail reform in terms of a judicial culture that permits excessive incarceration, the current reforms that we have in place really focus on exclusively predicting the behavior of defendants, which doesn't really make sense because they're not the ones who have the most agency in the process that produces these outcomes. So I think there is some really interesting work to think about in the process of designing a predictive tool. Could we do some power mapping where we think about who has the most agency in producing the outcome that we want to impact? And from there, use that as the starting point for figuring out, okay, whose behavior do we want to influence? Whose decision-making trends and patterns do we want to be able to model over time? And my prediction will be it'll often bump up against and cause friction with who do we have data about and about whom is data available. But that kind of theory of agency, I think, could be really, really useful at the beginning of some of these types of projects. Overall. And I think ultimately, in the end of the day, the value of this kind of project is really in helping us to build up our capacity to imagine the world more rigorously. So as Heather mentioned in the beginning of this, I think a lot of my work has really been trying to figure out how do we, from the beginning, try to challenge what are the default kind of solutions that are put on the table in terms of how we use data to address a given social problem, and how do we more rigorously engage with thinking about the potential of data to address that problem. Some of that's going to involve challenging the way the problem has been formulated from the beginning, and from there trying to think about creative ways of how we might either repurpose or generate new kinds of data to address that issue. So that's kind of where I wanted to pause for now. I think I've talked for about 30 minutes. I want to give time for questions, but I think at the end of the day, I think the goal, we really can't understate the value or how important it is to try to really build up our imagination as a tool for doing this kind of work, and think about ways that we can more rigorously imagine the future through and beyond data. So I'll just stop there.
Thank you so much. What a fantastic example. You can see in the chat. There's some of the messages in the chat are to everyone, and then some are private, but there's a lot of excitement and enthusiasm and real appreciation for the work that you did. Thank you for coming and sharing it with us as well. So, as promised, this is your chance to ask a question if you are attending live with us today. So if you want to unmute and ask a question, you can either raise your hand using like the Zoom hand raising thing, which is usually, depending on your version of Zoom, usually found in the reactions section, which is like a little smiley face with a plus on its head. Can click on that and then it'll say raise your hand. If that isn't your jam, you can unmute yourself and ask your question. So anyone in the room want to ask a question out loud. Also, if you don't want to ask your question out loud, you can put your question in the chat either so everyone can see it, or you can direct message it to me if you want to be entirely anonymous. That's totally fine. I'm Heather Kraus, and you can just direct message it to me. So while we wait and see if anybody in the room wants to ask a question, I'm going to read a couple that were direct message to me while you were talking. And the first is, did you get a response from the judges when you did your, like when you made your judge predicting machine? Did you get any responses from the judges?
Sure. I mean, so I didn't go super in depth in it, but we did kind of pair the quantitative dashboard with some qualitative work as well. So we did some interviews with judges,
Mhm.
and we did some of this during the process of designing this thing, which was really useful. I mean, I think in general, I think the judges were very skeptical. They always thought there was an ulterior motive to what we were doing. I always found it really interesting that they thought they all assumed we were really pro risk assessment. Many of them did, which was very interesting because really we were trying to move beyond risk assessment.
Right. Yeah.
But because that was such a charged issue in the state, risk assessments had been something that had been adopted and that they had resisted. So they were always trying to get at what our ulterior motives were to this.
Mhm.
Yeah, so that was the big thing. And then I think the other big thing that they always emphasized was that like the data was never going to be enough to kind of represent them accurately, right? So but they had no problem using data to kind of
Right.
make decisions about other people. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. This question is going to be my question because I think about this a lot, which is why I've been so interested in your work, because you're developing so many lived case studies of this. Um, have you ever, for two parts? Well, first of all, when you were doing that, where did you get the data on the judges? Was it like manually going to pages about judges, or is that information about judges publicly available?
Well, we had a data set that we received from the agency itself, and that
Okay.
required this reinterpretation, right, of data. So they gave us
Yeah.
criminal history data, and we went through it and figured out what could give us insight about judges, right?
Mhm.
Uh, so we took that data set and pared it down to information that we could reinterpret as indicative of judge behavior. And then when we did the speculative judge risk assessment tool, then we used Ballotopedia, which is
Mhm.
it provides information about judges who are elected, and in this state, the judges are elected. So we use that information basically to find the demographic information that we wanted to use to make our tool. Yeah.
Have you seen anything like this in education for teachers?
So this is an area of work that I'm really interested in. I would love to hear from educators or people who are kind of working on education, because my ongoing current project is really around student surveillance and kind of digital school security interventions.
Right.
Um, so I have not seen everything that I see coming out right now is really scary in terms of it's about either punitive approaches to kind of micromanaging teachers, or punitive approaches to monitoring and kind of pathologizing kids who don't fit some sort of normative like profile, right? They're queer, or they're kids of color, or some low income kids.
Mhm.
I have not seen anything that tries to like study up in an educational context right
Mhm.
now. I would love to hear from
Yeah.
who have though. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, one big difference is that judges are elected and educational folks are usually unionized. So there's already a really big difference in there. But I'm really interested in this for a bunch of reasons. And so maybe we'll have you back and talk about the whole education, how to study up in education is something that I think about every single day. And you're doing such a good job of studying up in the criminal justice system.
Mm,
Um, somebody saying I work in a university setting where we're always studying the students. Would
mhm,
centering the faculty and staff be useful? And if so, how? Oh,
mm,
yes, it's definitely useful. Um, uh, because it's exactly the same situation. With Chelsea's thing about who has the agency here.
mhm.
Also useful in child welfare is another place where these predictive algorithms are super controversial. Um, and it's often the child welfare professionals that are making decisions about whether children get to stay in the home or get removed from the home. But they're not being studied. So, Chelsea, you mentioned maybe doing some power mapping about who has agency. And Wheel Count has a couple of tools for power mapping, but I was wondering if you had a specific tool or practice that you liked to use for kind of power mapping to think about agency. I thought that was such a good point in terms of a person who's in a pretrial situation versus a judge is without any kind of, formal mapping. It's pretty obvious who's going to have agency there, but it gets more nuanced when we move into other parts of the criminal justice system or other parts of this. Do you have a way to do that you can talk about?
I mean, nothing that's super like formalized. I think I've learned about power mapping from community organizations who are really good at facilitating that. I myself haven't um, been the like facilitator of a group type of discussion, but I've benefited from those. And what I find to be really important in those discussions is really having, I think, the people who are, I guess, the most directly impacted for whatever thing we're talking about, having their perspective at the table, right? Because I do think there are a lot of blind spots or things that are overlooked as like bottlenecks or places where problems arise when it's really a top-down perspective. But the people who are having to navigate that system and go through all those, whatever bureaucratic kind of maze that they've got to work through to kind of get, say, their welfare check or their food stamps or, their whatever, those are the people who really have the best insight into like where does the power politics come into play? Who are the people closing the doors here and opening the doors, gatekeeping possibilities? So I think the most important thing is figuring out who to bring to the table. And then honestly, it's just putting a big piece of paper on the table and starting to map it out. People telling their stories and be like, so then I went to this office and when I went there, this is the challenge I came across,
Mm-hmm.
that way.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thanks. That's really, really helpful.
Yeah.
Lindsay, thanks for raising your hand. Go ahead. Hey, Lindsay.
Hi, I just wanted to jump in. I really, really appreciated this talk. This has been really clarifying for me and sort of hitting on some things I've been thinking a lot in my work. I work for a grant maker who does, gives grants to community-based organizations to do, anti-poverty, anti-homelessness, education related stuff. And we've been having a lot of conversations about our data. My role is data related, obviously. And right now we collect really primarily focused data focused on the people served themselves. Like how many people did you serve? What are all of their demographic categories? Give us like 4 different outcomes for all of these people. And we've been having a lot of conversations about what it would look like to shift from collecting so many outcomes about the participants themselves towards collecting data about how the system is working itself and trying to collect information about how the nonprofits are or are not positioned to do the work in the ways that they want to. And so, yeah, this talk really helped me sort of crystallize some thoughts that I've been having conversations about. So thank you so much for coming.
Yeah. Thanks so much for coming. It's encouraging to hear that, yeah, it's useful, to other folks as well. And I'd love to hear, and I'll drop my email in the thing. I just other spaces where people are kind of trying to do this study up approach. So I'd love to talk about them in whatever specific domains you guys are interested in talking about beyond this talk.
I really appreciate somebody who's working for like a money distributing organization saying that it's helpful, because a lot of times it is those organizations that are the hardest to, not to get to have the conversation, but it seems to be very slow going to get the process of giving out money to respond to data projects that study up. Um, and I work so often with people from the financial sector, or impact investing right now is very big, and like we got to make sure our portfolios are diverse. So the first thing they do is try and ask all of these grantees to start collecting demographic data and like say what races their leadership is, without really realizing how traumatizing that is, how labor and resource intensive that is, and how it's benefiting the benefit flows directly up the chain. It's not good for that organization to have to do it. It's good for the people managing the portfolio to have the data to say, like, look what we're doing. Somebody's putting in the chat, I work for a food security nonprofit, and we're struggling with this right now too. The federal government requires us to do quote unquote needs assessment, but what that is code for is trying to understand how we can reconfigure WIC and SNAP-Ed to get people to behave differently, rather than how we can reconfigure WIC and SNAP-Ed to actually serve the people it's trying to serve. So that's a great example of food security, a place to study up. Yeah, that's a great example.
Yeah. And I was just going to say, also riffing off of what you were saying, Heather, about the importance of kind of funders and in driving some of this stuff is also, I was trying to raise some of that with our court watching strategy, right? Because like as things shift to, funders really emphasizing data, now community orgs are trying to kind of accommodate that. Now they need to bring the data to the table, and it's just so labor intensive, especially when you need to collect data about really opaque institutions like the criminal legal system or the medical system or even the education system, all these systems that technically are supposed to be publicly accountable to taxpayers and things like that. It can be, now our whole workflow is about collecting data and not even doing the frontline service work anymore,
Exactly. And we have numerous documented examples of how, even when really well-intentioned, small mistakes in that data collection can destroy lives. I mean, we've just recently had 2 people lose their jobs because their educational records kind of outed them as LGBTQ plus in a conservative community, and that was it. They were unemployed, and it was through compliance with the federal demands on this educational institution. And then one person not quite having the right security settings on their computer. So it wasn't like hackers or anything fancy. It had nothing to do with AI. Like it was like the basics. It wasn't these big kind of things that are getting a lot of media attention about, like threats to equity. The threats that we actually have on a day-to-day basis are much closer to home a lot of the time. Okay. We are actually out of time, which again is amazing to me. These Friday Talking Data Equities go by so quickly. As promised, we will put this recording and links to lots of different material that Chelsea and her wide variety of collaborators have produced. And I highly recommend, if you have even 15 minutes this weekend, checking it out, because there are so many practical examples of the things that I know that we're all trying to articulate. So Chelsea, congratulations on the PhD, and a huge amount of gratitude for spending time with us today. We really appreciate it. And you will definitely be hearing from people who want to talk more.
Thanks so
All
much.
right.
Yeah.
Sorry for interrupting you, Chelsea.
Oh, I was just saying thanks. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. Take care, everybody. See you next Friday. Bye.
Bye.